Hello, folks, and welcome back to another episode of Radio Free Golgotha. My name's Al, and the wonderful, so far silent, handsome in the corner is Jesse. Hi, Jesse. How you doing?
I like silence. It's great. But it's also now I don't know what the intro is, but that's okay. I don't know if it was to try and do the Iranian barbaric of the massive Coronzon or.
Oh yeah, we can kick it off like that. We're outside of time here on a leap day.
Yeah, I think either way it's fine. We'll save the Iranian barbaric for later, or for Hi Cooper for editing. But hi, welcome to episode the 32nd of Radio Free Golgotha. This is a time out of time episode, which is fitting for our last releases as well. But so it's a theme already. But why I'm saying that is I'm dubbing this the Leap Feast of St. Oswald of Worcester in my heavily Americanized accent there. I know that hurt your ears out.
No, that was pretty good.
Okay. In comparing the pronunciations, it's just interesting. Worcester and Worcester. Very American, very Sylvester the Cat's son. But all right, so it is the feast of Oswald of Worcester, saint and archbishop. Sometimes Archbishop of York, or is the Archbishop of York, but sometimes Oswald of York, but not the same as Oswald of York that is Oswald of Northumbria.
Right. So simple. I don't know why anyone would get that confused. Yeah.
So as always, it's if Dead Magicians is a shot glass, then there's some other stimulant depressive you can take for hagiographic blur. So today, the February 29th episode will be the Feast of St. Oswald of Worcester, and the demon we are progressing in our time theme is Coronzon. Night Blooming Sirius is our herb. The mineral, we went very broadly with sand. Because why the fuck not? And then tarot card being Judgment or Eon in the Crowley deck. The figure is Poor. Is that correct?
I had Populous down here.
Populous. Never mind.
We can talk Poor as well, maybe. Look at the relationality.
Well, I'm going to have to change the artwork. But Populous is fine and dandy. And we're taking a backseat with tarot and figurative. They come as they go. And then our dead magician is Merlin, who is perhaps not dead at all.
And our genre of magic is metrics of time.
Yes, sorry. I knew I left one out because it's why have a note tab for that when it's just going to be fun.
It's time out of time, right?
Yes. So happy the 29th, and let's get started.
Faux show. All right, so as you said, we've got an Oswald. This is of the two Oswalds, this is the slightly less famous one, we might argue. This is not Oswald of Northumbria, who is beloved, as we've said, as a raven saint at the very least, and also a saint with occupying a curious space in the north of England as kind of sometimes said to be kind of balancing Northern European, let's just say Viking influence with the Christianity of the place and period. Again, we can probably get into him if we want to. Rather, we're talking about St. Oswald of Worcester, who, if we want to attach dates to, is born roughly around 925 Common Era and dies, appropriately enough, on February 29th, 992. And his feast day is celebrated when there aren't leap years, on the 28th of February. Or I also learned on the 19th of May in the personal ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter.
Anglican Catholics.
Yes. Yeah.
Voters. So Oswald of Worcester is, in my opinion, most certainly named for Oswald of Northumbria. He's 300 years later, and the cult of Oswald of Northumbria is starting to already be a huge upwave into the Middle Ages. The Raven King, let's say, or the King in the North, historically, as it were. So Oswald's already one of many Oswalds, and we've talked about hagiographic blur on this, but it just as we have talked about with Cyprian, especially when one saint is so proximal to another saint in name, the lore goes forward. So Oswald is riding an Oswald wave.
Yeah.
And certainly they're in the same area. They're, as far as when he goes up to York, he's in the north as it is.
Right.
But Oswald of Worcester is kind of not the most interesting saint. I hate to say that. He has miracles ascribed to him, certainly. But his big claim to fame is that, he's educated in France at the Abbey of Fleury and is a monk. And he returns to England at family request, and more family gets involved, and he is now making bishops and clergy, but he's ultimately known for ending secular priesthood. So he ends the idea that you can be married and be a priest. One of his big campaigns is to basically get rid of all the married priests and replace them with monks. So, kind of a big party downer there.
Yeah. That's a far more interesting way. It's often artfully framed as one of the three saints who revives English monasticism, as if it's this rejuvenation of things, which I guess, for monks it kind of is. And he's in good company there with St. Ethelwald and St. Dunstan.
Yes, the blacksmith saint. He's assisted by King Edgar at the time. He goes heavily into the rule of St. Benedict, which is the original monastic rule. So you're always going to go by ora et labora, pray and work constantly, but adapting it to a very specific and celebration of England, which is quite important and interesting, that it's what he learns in France is now going to be adapted for the specificities of the English priests and monks that he's writing this rule for. So he in turn is also asking people from Fleury and from other abbeys and monasteries to come to England. He's like, hey, it's really great here, come, you'll enjoy it. So he's proselytizing on behalf of the English monastic tradition that is now being, as you said, revived. He's also, there's a lot of details of it. There's a lot of lovely English names, Ethelwine, Ethelstan, Edgar, Oswald Slow,
his uncle, the Archbishop Odo, which is sometimes also Odo. And again, not to be too crass, but it's so funny that it instantly obviously made me think of Deep Space Nine. And the more we look for weird names and strange alien things, the more likely it is to have turned up in history already.
Yes. He was his Frithgod, his teacher. It's a Frankish teacher when he's in school. So we didn't choose him necessarily for this is unfortunate,
the bells and whistles.
The bells and whistles. But he is a practical saint. And truthfully, for me, the fact that he dies on the 29th is really the clincher here, right? That there is this day that happens that isn't always every 4 years, but roughly every 4 years for the most part, to align the solar-lunar discrepancy and the precession of the equinoxes being just trapped in there for that quarter damn day of how long we take to orbit the sun. But the 29th as a day, as a symbol, as a egregore, has all of those calendrical alignments and metrics of time encapsulated in it for me personally, which is why I was excited to be let's do the 29th. That'll be fun. So
and when I looked at it, actually finding out that he supposedly dies on that 29th of February 992 while washing the feet of the poor, as was this custom he had apparently during Lent. And so that link between the feet and the leaping of them is fun for me.
Yeah, certainly the bringing the head to the feet, even in service, right, is the Aries Pisces link, the giant hamster wheel of the zodiac.
Mm-hmm.
And also known for teaching the maths necessary to calculate dates. So specifically Easter, and Computus is also known for trying to look at biblical years to calculate the date of the Last Judgment. So there's a lot of time calculation even in his legacy, as it were. Yeah. But his funeral and shortly after his burial, there were miracles ascribed to him. And so he was quickly canonized. And his feast day, as you said, is the 28th of February or the 19th of May in the I'm trying to make an acronym of it, but I'm not doing well. The personal ordinariate, there we go, of the chair of St. Peter. And
ordinariate is such a theological word, studying theology and doing electives of it in university, just coming across all these words that, all words are made up, but that look especially made up,
Yes. Almost in a Philip Pullman or Susanna Clarkson, is that the Jonathan Strange?
Susanna Clark. Yeah.
Yes.
Very much so.
It's just adjacent to a word that you use more commonly.
Yeah, it feels a little dystopian, right?
Yeah.
Just ever so slightly. It wouldn't be out of place in some YA dystopian fiction thing.
So our lovely Oswald of Worcester was Archbishop of York, and there's this historic relationship between Worcester and York for quite some time back and forth. And there's a lot of politics with the king. But again, thank you for dying on the 29th, because it makes this episode far more interesting to go in that way. I do think that it's worth, if you don't know about Oswald of Northumbria, who maybe we can do another time, is a fascinating saint.
And I wonder if there's partly a naming link, because Oswald of Worcester is Danish, I believe, or from the place that we're later going to call Denmark. And so there is this, this sense of associating him with the Northmen in some way, which makes sense, not just in terms of the links between Mercia and Northumbria, but also, more specifically, he's a Northman coming around here and doing all sorts of monasticism.
Yes. So thank you, Oswald. We're going to pray for your intercession and calculate the date of the Last Judgment a little more accurately would be great. But speaking of Last Judgment, not to skip to the tarot card, but I'm excited for the demon of the day. And because there's so much mythic, there is a wealth of ascription to this specific demon, who is not a grimoiric demon as properly might be described.
Right. I have not come across an office of Coronzon, listing the composite chimeric form, the zoomorphic combination of, a lion with the head of another lion, or indeed any particular purviews over which he holds sway or authority. So, yeah, it's an interesting question, right? How grimoiric are the spiritual diaries of the angelical operations of Dee and Kelly, right? Because obviously that's the framing of Coronzon, right? Like we seem to encounter him first in the record in the material that gets called Enochian, then obviously plays this huge central role in Thelema, and then also plays this really interesting role in a variety of chaos magics as well. So yeah, that's a great point. Like when is a record of talking to spirits, of spiritual conversations, a grimoire, and when is it not? And looking at how people have endeavored, that's unfair. Looking at how Dee himself tried to turn his conversations and the visions of Dee and other scryers into more formal grimoiric material is really interesting. Like rather than, meeting these quote unquote like new or previously unheard of angels or spirits, it's pretty common in, say, like looking through, say, like James's The Evocation of Dr. John Dee, the Enochian Evocation, that he's very commonly porting in what they told him into the conjurations. You who said to me this, right? If we don't have a record of exactly what their role is and what, whether they turn you invisible or can teach you about the liberal arts or help you understand the, the mysteries and virtues of stones, herbs, and stars or what have you, that like he himself is trying to turn this into a more formal system. And then obviously you've got iteration after iteration of Enochian magicians also trying to either more formalize or more operationalize these conversations and visions and things.
Or change the spelling.
So I don't care about the H in there, the Choronzon versus Coronzon. What I am interested in is the Zom ending versus the Zon ending. The Zom is how it appears in the angelical records, and that's pertinent to me because is the angelical word that means to know or to understand, and it comes with a bunch of other words that are about like the power of understanding and that kind of thing, which is obviously like a big part of Dee's work. He's interested in understanding the mysteries of creation, and also in the sense of crossing the veil of Paraketh right into Binah, and the Sephira that gets translated into English as understanding.
Certainly. Okay, so Dee and Kelly describe this demon Coronzon without an H in True and Faithful Relation, right? I think that's
I've got that. Yeah, I've got the quote right here. It's almost like I prepared or something. It's Gabriel actually passes the message on. He's discussing Adam's loss of the angelical language when he fell from paradise, which is also fascinating, sidebar. But he refers to, it seems, Satan specifically as Coronzom, and says, so that in innocency, the power of Adam's partaking with God and with us, God's good angels, was exalted, and so became holy in the sight of God, until that Coronzom, for so is the true name of that mighty devil, so not necessarily Satan, but at least that mighty devil, envying his felicity, began to assail him, and so prevailed. And so there was this kind of like Tower of Babel-esque kind of thing, less about the hubris necessarily, but having this role as dispersing the original natural language of not just Eden, but of creation itself.
Interesting. The M you said comes up later in the angelical specifically?
The OM spelling?
Yes.
Yeah, OM turns up all the time. Yeah, Enochian's a compound language, and so it mashes together words to make longer words a lot of the time when it's not just having a very short word for a very, very complicated theological concept. But that means to understand or to know. And there's all sorts of different, what's the word I'm using? Like cases that it gets changed into, depending on whether you're talking about the noun, the knowledge, or the verb to know, or even like it looks like knowingly sometimes as like an adverb. So but there isn't, to my knowledge, there isn't a gloss given for like why that's his name or like what that means.
Okay. So we get from there going to Crowley's adapting or personal gnosis, which becomes codified within Thelema, of Coronzon being the dweller in the abyss. Like as you talked about, the veil of Parakat there, and this kind of demon of Da'at, which brings up whole concepts we've talked about before. That like it's interesting because in a lot of occult Kabbalah, there's always this reflection of this, or sometimes for many people, the obsession with the Qliphothic tree, the reflection, the overflowing of light. And I still will call to mind David Chaim Smith, the non-dualistic approach, that it's the same tree.
Right, as opposed to framing Darth in terms of like post-lapsarian stuff, that there was a more horizontally symmetrical tree that then gets like shifted down one, which is why Malkuth dangles. You've said before, like the proverbial dingleberry,
Yeah.
and that Darth is the shell or the ghost of what was once there. So it's automatically framed in this terms of like, used to be great and perfect, not so much now.
And even the concept that in all of our understanding, there is a limit to what we understand at the time. And this is the Clippa, that this is the shell of our understanding. And that as we expose light to that understanding, as we expose knowledge and try to understand that limit more, we might make that into, I believe Chaim Smith talks about as Cliff and Loga, like, which of course is the brilliance, a script attributed to Venus sometimes, but this
shining one, right?
The shell itself starts to break because of its exposure to light, and that we break through our understanding. Of course, there's another limit beyond that. That's another Clippa. That's another shell. That's another hard boundary around our understanding. And that our job or our aim, our course in the waters of this abyss is to constantly seek the horizon, right? The horizon keeps going. But at some point, we do cross the horizon of what we knew. And so there's a relationship there to, I think, for me, that is evoked with Coronzon, that is about that demon of the horizon, that I will attain that thing. Well, you can't truly attain the thing. You can go in its direction, which is a lovely non-dualist fuck brain wonderfulness. It's exciting for me.
Yeah.
Past the chaotic days of my 90s youth salad. But Crowley takes it as the CH with an N on the end. As the demon of dispersion, it's a personification of the forces in the abyss. So this is, a little bit of the Nietzschean consciousness projected into the abyss that then looks back at you. And so the ideal with Coronzon is to evoke so that you may master your own ego. So under the right circumstances, Coronzon is then used in a Crowleyan school to destroy the ego or cause ego death. So there's a lot of, extrapolations from that too, used by various chaots and people who were inspired by this too, because there are many other ways to undergo ego death, of which Coronzon is especially identified in Southern California. Magical inheritance as an LSD heroic dose that, forces you to confront the ego. And the small rituals of our practice, to erect the tent or the pillars as described in different systems, is ultimately what you use to retain your humanity or to gain your humanity from, I guess, a Gurdjieffian sense, in the unification of the plurality of voices that as you cross the abyss, you must wear all bodies at once to fully manifest the body of light in whatever. This is a very mixed trajectory here. But
that's also telling, because like that's very much the contemporary discourse about Coronzon, right? Like that it does mix in all sorts of different mystic and psychological and theological concepts, right? Like just going through, like searching the internet for what people say about Coronzon on forums and things. What's the kind of popular conception or the sort of like folk cosmology of him? And yeah, it's often talked about as like the dweller at the threshold that awaits anyone on the brink of ego dissolution or those close to succeeding the great work, right? The or is framed as the opposite of the holy guardian angel and represents some form of shadow self, or even, people sometimes say that it's the shadow self of humanity's collective unconscious. So there's like all sorts of different schools vying and being dispersed and reformulated, even in talking about what Coronzon is and what it's for.
Yeah, certainly. And this also, Coronzon is always linked to the Vision of the Voice workings, right, with Newberg.
Yeah.
And the 19th Ether Call and the evoking of Coronzon onto, most people agree that it's Crowley is in the triangle and is the medium unto which the demon was evoked. And so there's this, it's a strange attacking force that is dangerous. And the account is sometimes considered fantastical or unreliable. Right. But in, was it 418? The greatest precautions were taken at the time and have since been yet further fortified to keep silence concerning the right of evocation. So at some point, Crowley gets the idea, as they're traveling away from this original site, to use sex magic as a way to nullify his ego, and becomes, according to lore, the passive partner of Newberg, and this ego death that he undergoes, anal penetration. He gets pegged by Newberg, often is so spotlighted for so many different agendas as part of the perversities and everything that are cited with the OTO and Crowley and things like that. But ultimately what he's looking at is just, it takes a lot to bottom well, and there's a lot of emotional release that can go on with it. So the accounts seem to differ and go back and forth. But Crowley describes in Confessions in chapter 66, the name of the dweller in the abyss is Coronzom, but he is not really an individual. The abyss is empty of being. It is filled with all possible forms, each equally inane, each therefore evil in the only true sense of the word. That is meaningless but malignant, insofar as it craves to become real. These forms swirl seamlessly into haphazard heaps like dust devils, and each such chance aggregation asserts itself to be an individual and shrieks, I am I, though aware all the time that its elements have no true bond, so that the slightest disturbance dissipates the delusion, just as a horseman meeting a dust devil brings it in showers of sand to the earth. So there's this lovely facing that happens here and the confrontation of, well, dualism, as already has been mentioned, that
Right.
in proposing that you are crossing the abyss, the subject part of that sentence is canceling the verb as far as the theory behind this. So you cannot say you are enlightened. You can just be enlightened. If you can say you are enlightened, then you are below the at. That there is the, I am that versus I am I. And this is where you get into like the Sufic heresies, right? Of the La ilaha illallah, there is no God but I. Not as a you are the all-powerful God, but to separate yourself from God denies the oneness of God. And to further quote, the first time I heard the quote was Dave Hyman-Smith at a lecture, was God is one but not in counting, is what we're going for here. So we're not talking about the existence of God, but we're talking about a unity of all things, a oneness as opposed to one followed by two.
Right.
So there's a lot of things. As you said, it's controlled by Babylon at the time, which Crowley asserts is comparable to the Holy Guardian Angel, as I understand it. And you brought up Bina as the force here. But the idea that there is an ability to control or engage with this is part of the secret work. This is part of everybody's work. And for many to read between the lines here, because I'm not in the OTO and won't profess to, even though certain rituals are published, the idea here that you would confront some version of yourself in all this to understand the shape-shifting thing that exposes who you are. We see this as a common theme, right, in many movies, whether it's, The Cell or various Star Trek episodes or anything along the sides. The
Cave of Dagobah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The thing is almost like the emanation body in Tantric Buddhism, but there is a way for the demon that is ourselves, that is our own nature, to find some way to grasp at itself. And I think we've talked about this too in other forms, and for me is interesting in the study of possession and trance and things like this, that the observation that is the statement within the consciousness as you are feeling something come in, that sometimes the observation can be passive, where you are able to observe without commenting and therefore without changing necessarily, although all observation changes. But for a lot of us, for a lot of people, the excitement at the observation is also a form of the ego clawing at the walls of your consciousness to be like, I know what's going on. And that can inhibit trance. It can inhibit the insertion of other influences that may be desired or undesired.
Not just constantly asking yourself, sitting in Zazen, am I enlightened yet? But literally being more like, oh, was that enlightenment there?
Yeah.
Was that possession there?
Yeah, exactly. That, oh, I think I'm getting possessed. Well, we are possessed at all times, by our consciousness most of the time. So it's just interesting. There's something related there. And you see, of course, Coronzon explored in comic books, right? Sandman, and brought up, and it just becomes kind of a pop figure as the Dweller on the Threshold, whether it's the Guardian of the Abyss and the Hammer House movies. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Coronzon in Sandman is the champion that Lucifer elects to battle Morpheus to regain his helm, right? Like near the beginning. Yes. And again, he's doing the classic, as we'll see later, like the mythic shape-shifting contest that, we'll get with Merlin and stuff in a bit. So again, not so much dispersing forms as having no singular form, but potentially also a responsive and reactive form, right? In the turn-based shape-shifting combat that's going on.
Yeah, the quote-unquote oldest game, which is a perfect way to attack Coronzon, right? Or to engage with Coronzon. And this idea of fighting the antinomian anti-life with hope. Hope is constantly creating, and that's the triumph, right? There's a lovely side to all that. There's within Chaos Magick, in the same way that you've discussed, right, that Satan becomes or transmutes into this Coronzon figure that can be engaged with, and kind of in Chaos Magick, as I understand it, trying to always evolve itself and move through things and past things and just to expose things. In looking at the dogma of Thelema, starts to have Coronzon be a figure that you willingly engage with in something like the Mass of Coronzon, which is about casting one's ego into the universe towards an end. And there's a lot there. People are going to criticize either way, but I do love that Coronzon rides the 333 current into the world So like the mass itself is pretty short, and even though I said it's Barbadian Iraq, I'm pretty sure it's all Enochian because of the way that it's done. So, the invocation of Kia, and then the silence, and then actually invoking Coronzon, which, if you translate the words, this is all available online to look at. In government, I have set my feet in the earth. I am the power 333 of the 10th Aether, whose name amongst you is the god of conquest, furnishing a power of to dispose of all things understanding, division, one thing, let it confound with another. Confound understanding, move. I say with darkness, the lower beneath, let them vex upon the earth, heavens. I prepare for the earth government.
Yeah, I mean, if that's not in Enochian, it certainly is heavily using the English version of that language. Yeah.
After well, even Anatap Othil, Lutzi, Kausagi, Zirdo, Lonsi, Depede, Sarsax,
Yeah.
Sobadoain in Maid, Zilo Darpe.
Yeah. Madzillodarp, the god of stretch forth and conquer. Yeah. Conquest. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Korski is various takes on the earth. Yeah.
So there's a lot going on here, and then the lightning flash, the vanishing with laughter as it goes on, but this idea of putting Coronzon at your ego out into the universe to accomplish a magical result with the mass itself.
Yeah.
So it is something very short, but it is quite hypertrophied ego, like it's a quick side. And the notes for it by Carol do describe it as that the ritual should be considered partly as an act of divination. That, after the statement of intent, Kia is invoked, and then in a blasphemous and catastrophic attempt to conceptualize Kia as anything other than a formless pregnant void, Coronzon is manifested by a visualization of oneself in the form of one's grossly hypertrophied ego, whilst the incantation is given. The ritual is concluded with 3 simultaneous acts. The lightning flash in the form of the solar sigil or victory rune is flashed on the head from the ground. A loud martial arts Kia is shouted, and the wand is struck against the ground, vanishing with laughter afterwards. So, why the fuck not?
Why the fuck not? And it strikes me in terms of like the history of magic here that it's also kind of a telling example of how Thelema but being engaged with in like what sometimes gets called like free range Thelema outside of formal OTO structures. Not battery farmed or anything. They live a good life before you slaughter them. Being demonstrative of how Thelema kind of develops and in some cases kind of replaces the Egyptomania of the 19th century, so-called occult revival of the Golden Dawn and so on. That it deeply influences not just professional or, deeply committed magicians, but a general sense of like a folk conception of what magic looks like at all. Do you know what I mean? Like it plays into, or it contributes to a broader, conception of what it is that a magical ritual looks like, what it's for, how you do it.
Yeah. I mean, it's the things we talked about before, like the Xeroxing or the Googling of anything, or the Gardnerian trap, as I like to call it, right? Like if you're going to purport certain mythos out there, then the mythos is open sourced and people will do with it what they will.
Yes. And again, we're back to the gong I love to beat on, which is that mutations from textual transmission to actual like deployment and work in people's actual magic and practice and lives is not just a matter of corruption or of data loss or of not understanding the true secrets. It might be, but it's also demonstrative that it is popular and is approached as if it can do something useful for you.
Yes. The change happens because people are using it.
Yeah.
Language changes because it's being used.
Yeah.
We find this is much to the dismay of people who are, especially in the legal profession. But, this is how we have evidence of what are the evidences for folk practice being within a culture, that there are 17 extant variants and another 20 in literature.
Yeah. Nature is messy.
Yeah, and the more messy a language is, any language by my lovely postmodern NYU education, whether that be a religion or a magical system, the more complex something is, oftentimes the older it is. If there's so many rules, it's because people have been using it and said, I don't agree with that. Like, we're going to change it. We're going to impose spelling and grammar, and double negatives don't mean the same thing anymore. And
right. And where do sociolects and class come into this as well, of like deciding that we talk like this because we don't talk like that.
Yes. Or more importantly, we don't talk like them.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Okay, so I feel like Coronzon has their due.
Mm-hmm.
This is the original they them.
Truly.
Legion unto itself. So I think sand is a lovely kind of exploration of that because of the multitudes there, right? We chose specifically not a singular rock, although sand does have its like certain compositions of variance, which is, things like color and location. But sand itself evokes time for us because of the hourglass and other things. But I do think there is a lot here with sand that we don't always talk about overtly, nor do I remember seeing it in any lapidary, like outright.
No.
I feel like it's perhaps a bad oversight that we don't see more discussion of the magical properties of sand.
Yeah, I mean, there's the old like geological intervention, if we want to say that sand isn't one thing, that it is, like we were saying, billions of individual fragments of minerals and stones and shells and such. And you were just telling me about what's the fish?
The parrotfish that chomps on coral and produces huge amounts of beach sand.
There we go. Yeah.
Like huge amounts of beach sand are just directly from a fish eating coral. As that fish dies and as the coral reefs die, like sand seems so plentiful, but sand, I believe, or there was a documentary that after water is the most robbed natural resource.
Damn.
Because like borders are changing in 10-foot increments so that countries can have more access to sand and on riverbanks and things like this, because sand is how we make glass. It's used in many other things, but it's just this idea that sand itself is an incredibly hot commodity. There's different forms of whether you have coral or volcanic rock or garnet, olivine, dune sand, right? Glass, quartz and stuff, like all these different things are there and produce these different colors. But sand is, with the exception of maybe black sand that is, and the white sands, which are so out of the ordinary, there is this kind of earth tone sand color that is an orange, whether it is a brownish orange or a brighter hued orange. But there is something here that is a warmth, right? We associate sand with the desert and the beach. Cold beaches are rocky, warm beaches are sandy. So says my infant brain. But the idea that the deserts were the bottoms of oceans is its own thing, and a much more modern conception, right, to understand it in that way.
Yeah.
But I think of the call for river sand in some invocations, and not only just like in the kind of, especially now in the increasing familiarity with ATRs and dirt magics that have been resurrected from European practice, like beach sand has its own quality, right? There's a shifting there. There is the tide itself, which isn't necessarily coming and going, but feels like it, right?
Yeah.
As I just watched some meme with Degrassi Tyson talking about how we're spinning into the bulge that is always there. It is not actually rising and falling. At the same time, I can't hear you over high tide and low tide. But my fascination with sand actually first came from a teacher who had what was it was painted in Golden Dawn colors, and she was not a member of the Golden Dawn, but in that lovely 90s way of like everybody using the tools that they could to do their witchcraft.
Okay.
But it was painted so brightly, and there was sand, beach sand in it. And she had water that was like in those fancy bottles with the swig tops that are metal that kind of, they're used for fancy Italian sodas a lot of times. She had these on a shelf that had specifically fulgurized rainwater. So water that has fallen during a lightning storm, during a planetary hour. And she would take a small amount of this with distilled water, and based on the question that you had, she would then wet the sand with, she knew the exact amount to get her sand kind of in that lovely sandcastle state. And she would pull out a very specific rod that was painted in 7 colors and dap dots. And this was how she cast Geomantic Shield. And it was her portable sandbox. But the sand accumulated over time. All of this, you couldn't ask too many questions because the sand was wet from somebody else's planetary subject.
Right.
So she could, of course, ask a Wednesday question on, a Mercury question on a Wednesday, but there was something to it that in wetting it with specific waters, that it was also, the spirits have been invoked into this sand. And that they were answering through this specific sand. So could you build 7 boxes? Sure. But that's not how she worked. She waited for it to dry and the next day would consult again. And they followed the same rules. Ironically, even though it was rainwater that was fulgurized, which is not when you would normally read the oracle, right? Because there's weather
conditions, storms specifically are said to potentially mess with the answer.
Yeah, and of course there's this idea that if it was originally sand casting, that mud is not what you want to read. So I get that, but I found the interesting thing of her utilizing the storm of the person's question to then find clarity in the sand.
Right, because you're not, yeah, exactly. Sorry, I'm getting excited about this.
No, get excited. That's fine.
I absolutely adore this. Yeah. But that's the thing, right? You've gone through the storm, and this is the evidence of having survived it. I'm still alive. Like
Yes.
I can now look at the pieces as they've fallen and derive a sense of what's going on and where to go from here.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I like this, the notion therefore of that. And I also appreciate, because she grew up Eastern Orthodox, and more than like if we're from the Catholic background, I know like you're using a little electric candles by the 80s when I'm aware of them, or you're using small votives, right? But they're in glasses still. As the Orthodox candles are the thin beeswax ones, which are put in sandboxes. So sand actually gets associated with fire safety and petitioning prayer itself. Yeah. So in folk charms where there's Eastern Orthodox candle magic being done, you can get the candle stubs, but the sand itself contains the remnants of prayers. The flames, the prayer, the inflamed prayer has gone into the sand when it is extinguished. So grabbing things from that sandbox itself also is used in countless things.
Yes, the memory of sand is fascinating to me in terms of, programming it either to prime it to the question you're asking, or taking some of the sand that a figure has been marked in as a witness of that figure having fallen.
Yeah.
Yeah, the memory of sand and how it gets, exactly what it's exposed to. And the fact that it is, sure, it's crumbled, it disperses, it constitutes the earthy component of the dust devils that we've already mentioned. But it's not ash. It doesn't go to nothing, right? It's still a testament that things were shaken up but still exist in some form.
Smaller than gravel and coarser than silt, which is our starting invocation, right? But,
yes.
And also to think that, like, the idea, again, beach sand is specifically what's sought out, which has a lot of coral and things in it too. 50 billion tons of beach sand and fossil sand are used each year in construction currently. And desert sand is not suitable for concrete. So it is a non-renewable resource. So go hoard your beach sand. But it is impressive to understand how much is going on here with sand as a resource that is almost forgotten about. And so there's also the other side that calls to mind is doing sand baths, sand heatings. Right. So just as you have the Mary bath, but you have the sand bath as a way to keep something warm, but not heat it past a certain temperature. Right. So you put a burner on a tray of sand, which will then incubate. So a lot of times, if you're trying to keep something in an incubated state, in my back room Bronx alchemy of the styrofoam cooler containers filled with sand with a heating pad on the bottom of the styrofoam, which won't melt the styrofoam, but also is about keeping the sand warm to a certain extent, right? So that you can keep whatever thing you have cooking in there in a warm state.
Yeah, and it's not cooking it to calcine it. You're not like trying to destroy something or purify something. I think of a dear friend, Professor Porterfield, and his class on lamp magic being called like a hen on her eggs, right? This incubatory heat that you tend and you keep going to birth something, right?
Yeah.
Or to continue giving a nurturing heat to a warmth. Yeah, yeah. The one other angle I've been kind of tossing around is the sands of sleep as well. Like being the term for, I mean, certainly in my family, like the grainy stuff in your eyes when you wake up is also called sleep. You have sleep in your eyes. But the idea of like the personal concerns of that and their links to dreaming and to dream incubation and to kind of incepting dreams into people.
Yeah.
And again, the transient nature of it, right? It's like sand, it is that which moves, but rather than shifting in a desert or even like, by the tides of a beach, it's the shift of night to day again, and of the waking, and of REM moving to the supposedly yawny waking mind.
Yeah. There's also an older ascription that I think I remember coming out because it's definitely a cultural thing where people aren't familiar with it, but washing dishes with sand is a big thing. So if you're on a riverbank, using the river sand to scrub your plate clean in the river, you're not using a sponge or a scouring pad, you're using the sand that's there. So sand has an association with cleaning as it is. And so there's something there, right? There's
by its slightly, by its slightly caustic, dispersing nature.
Yes. So you can also, like within Islam, right? The idea that you have to wash your mouth, your face for prayer, which is wudu, right? But there's tayammum. My pronunciation is terrible, but the ritual purification using purified sand or mud even in order to get yourself clean for prayer. So this understanding that sand is associated with cleaning as much as anything.
Yeah, and again, it's one of those things that it's sometimes linked back to observations of the natural world of like birds, washing themselves in sand rather than water because that will mess with their feathers.
Yes, and it will make the mites go happily away.
Right. I may have mentioned it before, and I'd love to corner our friend Sam Block at some point a bit more, but he has mentioned in some posts he'd come across a possibly mythic origin of Ramel, of geomancy itself, as maybe being inspired by people marking or noticing the marks of birds' feet landing in sand and then taking off again.
Truly the language of the birds there. The describing of the birds.
Mm-hmm.
So in addition to brick and glass and concrete and mortar and paint and all these different things, we also get sand casting, which is the way to use metal, pouring molten material. It could be glass, could be metal. Lead is a common thing to imprint something into sand, and then through that tight grained sand that's slightly wet usually too, you can make a mold and use it to have a foundry, right, to shape further things into that. So you see this commonly on YouTube videos with like aluminum pots and making things in sand specifically as a way to duplicate things, getting scrap aluminum and melting them in order to make aluminum cookware through sand casting.
Right. Again, it will contain heat in a way that is beneficial.
Yeah.
Productive, is generative in some way.
And with cleaning too, you get sandblasting, which we know is extremely abrasive. Like, right, it's going to pull the flesh from the bone, as it were. But there used to be, we all know the dangers of too hot sand on the feet at the beach. And the need for that, but you also have sand being heated extremely hot and thrown on people during invasions to protect castles and things like this, that the sand traps and things were done. So in addition to that, biotenacious earth comes to mind too, because it's its own weird form of like ashy sand, but it literally expels, like kills certain invertebrates, and it has its own power right there of being scattered. The sand that we normally, like, I think we also have to mention like Sex on the Beach, not as sexy as you think it is.
It gets everywhere.
It's in so many cracks. But yeah, I think there's something there. There's something so beautiful about all of that. And the notion that a spirit or demons might appear on, mud from the bottom of the river, which can be interpreted as sand in that way. That there's this constant need for things that have flowed. I think about the Lighthouse Peninsula here in town, which is on the Hudson, and the Hudson flows north for 6 hours and south for 6 hours, and the sands of that island, which are sometimes overtaken when there's higher tide, especially during full moons, it's very possible that waves will go over the whole island. You get sand then that is used to water flowing both ways, which, as far as shifting sands go, you can't get much more potent than that. Like, that's an unstable ground. And I think about the alleged punishments of Masons who break their oaths, because I shall not break any alleged oaths, but cutting off your tongue and burying it at the point where the tide is the low water mark. Right, sands of the beach, where if you're going to flap your tongue, then your tongue will be flapping for all eternity.
Yeah, and that's another point about like deployment of things at the point where low and high tide wash in and out. It's also a way of deploying a talisman or a working of some kind that you want to keep working, that is going to be like a perpetual motion thing, that it's going to get jarred awake and active again as the tide goes back and forth across it. Yeah, the flow and what's left behind, right? The salt trail that we can trace an extinct river or or hidden tears over. Yeah.
There's something interesting too in the flow of time here that, like, I don't know, I thought it was the other way when I was little, that sand was like baby rocks that were going to grow. And of course it's the opposite, right? We can melt these things and through earth heat itself, fuse these grains together again. But we are looking at the bones of rocks. We're looking at time exerting itself on one of the more strong representations of immortality, being rock. And so itself is this wonderful, the sands of the hourglass, and the measurement of time that is there is quite interesting. Whether it's on a dune in the wind or in the wet sands of the beach, where you stand and let yourself slowly be buried, right, with the sand washed in.
Sinking. Yeah, there's that physicality of the memory of mountains in the tiniest grain of sand, in which there is infinity, apparently, according to Uncle William Blake. Yeah. I absolutely that's absolutely why I'll push for us weaving in populace with this. For me, populace is very present in the ways millions of tiny individual things, grains of sand or snowflakes or seconds ticking by or breaths, make up a whole of some kind, a beach, a winter scene, a lifetime, and so on. And so, this idea of, the calendrics of it, but also the what's left, but also the potential for something else to form from that field of potentiality.
Yes. Yeah. I think the relationship then to something as conceptual and somehow measurable as time is there, right? Like, obviously we have the hourglass, but I think what was the impulse with this metrics of time? Yes, we have the day that's out of days, the kairotic shift of February 29th, or much like an eclipse, is like there's something alluring to this. How do we capture this time out of time?
Right, special days.
The jokes that are there with people that are born on the 29th, that they're, a quarter of the age of everybody else. Well, no, they're still aging. But this idea, well, they didn't have their birthday. It's kind of like, it's not tomorrow if you don't go to bed.
Yes. The night never ends if we never go inside. Yeah. Our friend Matthew Barclay, I don't know if he'd mind me saying, is a leap year baby, and I got to go to his 10th birthday. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. If the number isn't there, then it doesn't count. Yeah, that's fascinating.
So I think the notion there, as far as metrics of time, because it's a can of worms, right? Because time being, I think, as I happily posted, that time is a pancake and I am the syrup. Time is something that greatly eludes, and there's been studies in this too. So as far as metrics, no one is very 100% accurate with like what a minute is, right? But generally, there are people that say a minute is around 52 to 54 seconds, and there are people that believe it's about a minute 7 to a minute 9. And something in that shift is what also make the people that think a minute is shorter show up on time and early for things. The people that think a minute is longer tend to be on time and late for things.
Right. We're behind the turn of the clock. Yeah.
I did not implicate you in that statement.
That was very much a royal we, wasn't it? Yeah.
But no, it was a royal we that you are calling us both out. So there's the perception of time itself, right? That there's an internal shift, that attention, desire. What's the Einstein quote that like sitting on a stove a minute is forever, but staring at a pretty girl, it's very short. That is paraphrased from my father telling me that from when I was like 5. So come for me.
Good solid dad wisdom.
Yeah, exactly. And quoting or misquoting Einstein at the time. So the relativity of time there being important. I think with metrics, as far as we go, like one of the things that I know that you are, I won't say obsessed, that tickles your pickle is the alignment of a magical circle to the time of day, time of year, and so on. That the circle is meant to be a shift out of time, and that part of doing so is denoting the time that is happening. Which was my segue to say, talk about that, Al.
Yeah. Oh, if you insist. Pickle tickling intensifies. Yeah, the names around a circle are partly a cheat sheet, and we're talking here like about the Heptameron and its basis in the Lucidarum Necromantia, and that basis in parts of the SSM, the Summa Sacra Magia. That yes, you are on the one hand drawing out the names so that you can remember them and refer to them, right? So when you are standing in the middle of that circle, it's a cheat sheet. But it's also, demonstratively forming the, if you will, like the flow of time around the circle. Yeah. And I'm talking here not so much about the names of the angels of the hours, although that's very important. And again, that's, a long-standing tradition from Apollonius of Tyana, the prayer of Adam in the Seferet Sil Hahamalek, Albuni's Shams Ma'araf. Shout out to Jay and Amina for their wonderful edition of that recently. But specifically, the names of times themselves, which are sometimes elided with the names of the angels of that time, and sometimes they're different. And one of the things I've been particularly interested in of late is the supposedly, quote, heavy scare quote, bunny ears, secret names of the seasons, the 4 seasons, and that seasons themselves have names, and that the sun and the moon and the earth, and if we keep going back through the SSM, the planets, the zodiacal signs, like everything potentially has a secret or a intimate name depending on what season it's in. Brian Johnson's done a wonderful little pamphlet on the orations from SSM on exactly this. Wonderful, helpful tables. Who doesn't love a good table? But what I love about them is the sense that in being able to articulate what a season itself is called. And again, how much is that an energetic model versus an animist model? Of course, the season also has a spirit of its own, that you are not just marking the turn of the year in terms of cultural or even religious festivities, although, love me some goat milk, hot chocolate, and emok, etc. But that in the turn of them, you are marking something that can then be present for the rest of that time. that you are honoring do you want to call it the rulers of the time or some of the magical essential nature of that particular period of time, that you are not just capturing a zeitgeist as a moment, but as a momentum. And that, not just a particular Sabbath or even the wheel of the year itself, but the concept of doing anything like that at all. And what's also particularly interesting to me is how those names are used in operative sorcery. Again, not just to mark and to celebrate. That's the ritual studies distinguishing. Not just as a ceremonial indicative appeal or celebration of the turning of the wheel of the year and yay, we're still alive, but an actually like ritually operative thing that changes or at least gives you access to the capacity to change things in that period of time. I've been finding a bunch of examples of, there's an operation in Rawlinson D 253, which was edited by Stephen Skinner as A Cunning Man's Grimoire from Golden Horde. There's an operation in there for making the sun shine, for like clearly sort of a mixture of, good holidays and also like good growing season, which uses those names of the seasons, the names of the sun specifically in the different seasons. So you are taking a component of a very formal, pious conjuration system like that elucidated by the Summa Sacra Magia and finding folk applications of it. Okay, if this is the secret name of the sun in this season, what else can I do with that other than formally inscribing it into a circle and having all the dribbly candles and all of the exorcisms of the air and prayers to the four directions and things like that? What else can you do with it? And that really fascinates me. And we see other examples of that, not just in, the example I just gave is from a, early modern English cunning person's working book, their like personal spell book of experiments and formulae and charms and things. But we also see it in older Jewish folk magics as well, especially again, if we look through the Prayer of Adam, which is the first opening bit in the Ratsail Hamalek, which can be distinguished. It's the one that turns up in 1701 in Amsterdam, as opposed to the 13th century compilations of also called Ratsail. There's a lot of books attributed to, the Angel of God's Mysteries. And again, they are heavily used for these applications of the names of the seasons and the names of the sun and the moon and the earth in those seasons for, mostly for a lot of agricultural stuff, for looking after your camels or ensuring that your cucumbers grow properly. And again, that to me highlights this aspect of like marking those turns of the seasons so that the rest of that season is good for you, right? So the Prayer of Adam has an operation when seeking to make the earth fertile, take water and pour it upon the earth, speak the names of the earth in every season. The earth will absorb the water at once. So you are not just necessarily using them for one season, but to make the earth fertile the whole year round. Right, you're doing something at this point that will seed better and greater likelihood of success and prosperity and a good life and so on for the whole year to come. And so the part gets to, I guess, holographically be a link to the whole.
Yes, that side is so easily evident or so strongly evident in folk practice. And you see a lot in traditional craft in the 90s and as it continues to develop into, often what's called folkloric craft and things like this now. But the capturing of a time of the year through the ritual designation of, like, as you talked about, like, it is honoring the Sabbath, that tide, as it were. But the things from that ritual can then be used to spur things forth at a later time. So you've talked about how certain geometric sigils get to be put on a lot of pentacles because manifestation and conjuration have certain expressions within the geometric figures. It makes sense for something to come together under a conjunctigo sign.
Exactly. And it's about not just the goal of why you're making this pentacle in the first place. Yes, we do see a lot of acquisitio sigils or geometric characters in not just Jupiterian pentacles, but other pentacles for wealth. Right. But we also, by far and away, the one I see the most is conjunctio, because as I understand it, because I found conjunctio incredibly effective, not just for doing crossroads shit, right? Not just for that being the goal to connect things up, but the means by which something else happens. Right. Whatever work you're doing has a means to get there, has a road to get there. So the X that marks the spot of conjunctio's form is also crosshairs. You can absolutely put personal concerns on a prepared point of conjunctio to ensure that the connection between the client and the work is strengthened, right? That's not the same as achieving the goal, but it is a way of working geomantically by method as well as by end goal. And that's something I'm very grateful to continual experiments and conversation with our friend Peter Lakeham about. He and I have done a lot of that kind of thing.
So what you see comparatively is like if you look at, I know we just talked about this a couple episodes ago, but well, it was last year, figuratively. But as far as like looking at this, and I think a prime example, you do see some of this in Nigel Jackson's like describing the air. It's one of the hallmarks of traditional craft in the 90s. One of the things that differentiated it from Wicca, one of the few things, was not ascribing elements to quadrants. That it was not about a Golden Dawn following or creating a microcosm of English winds, but instead understanding that there are things in the quadrants based on the season of the year that are going to be different balances of many things, including winds, as opposed to elements themselves being fixed, or the mighty dead that are in those quadrants, or spirits, Spirit of the Watchtower of the East. So when you get to like Chumbly and you're doing like, by the time the Dragon book comes around, which was conceived of in the 90s and gets published much later publicly, but the idea that the Sabbats have names and they can be used in a mantric formula. So, you know, Aihu Saba Ku La Tan Hua as the main 8 Sabbats. But when you are invoking a god who is tied to one of the Sabbats, you might use Hu, for instance, which is the Candlemas name, as part of the mantric recitation to get that god to come, because that is the god that officiates over the faithful gods that officiate over Hu. So Yimaloy Lucifera, Tubula Lucifer, for instance. It invokes not only the northeast, but red, a specific wood, you know, which is whitethorn in this case, but like it's calling a specific thing, which is a specific direction, which is a specific time. And so the idea that you could stitch these things together in different ways, that if you were trying to make something come to fruit, that by the time you get to Ba, that if you literally Ba, right? Like Ba itself is Walpurgisnacht. So this is, we should see spring moving by this time, right? We should see the start of quote unquote summer happening. The last snows should be melting.
Right. There's an empirical link, right? It's
yes.
not just an arbitrary division of time. It's based in empirical observation.
Yes. So using the seed syllable of Ba brings out the gods who exist at that time. Their heraldry, their power, whatever it is, it can be invoked in the seed syllable itself. So even though you might be acknowledging another time, or the times between Sabbaths might be Saba, so the period between spring and Walpurgisnacht. So you can do a rite where Saba is going to align you with the time that you are in, because you're no longer in Sa, but you're not in Ba yet. So there is a time where Ba is the zeitgeist and that rides it, but there are tides. This is a very common conception from traditional craft in the 90s too, talking about Sabbaths as tides, because it is a peak. We don't know when Imbolc is going to come. There is St. Bridget's Day, but we don't know when the lambs are going to milk. And so are you going by land signs, or are you going by calendrical dates, or a combination of both? Because as you've explained many times, we have record within English popular culture that yes, there is a Saints' Day, but if it's a popular Saints' Day, they're going to celebrate it probably the following weekend when everybody can actually do it. And very much so when the weather is good. Because if it's raining on that day, they're not going to not celebrate it.
Yeah.
So the days themselves are mutable, and in that way, it accesses something out of time, right? So I like this idea of naming things for certain times of the year, bringing back the artifacts and the detritus of that time. One of the things for some groups, the drinking of ashes from the offerings that were burned from the previous year to welcome back the tide that's coming in.
Yeah.
What was not finished last year now we're in that time again. Now we bring it forth. So you can cheat these things. I think of things like winter sowing on a practical level, right? Where you're literally using little Chinese food containers to do your Jiffy pellets full of things that are going to get a jump start now in February, so that when late April comes, you can actually put them outside. This is a way of cheating time. And I love the idea of, when my godmother used to do this a lot, I loved her winter sowing because it was specifically used food containers that had already sustained and nourished her. And I was like, the magical act of that is like, you didn't buy new ones. You used ones and reused ones. And this idea of repurposement in that way is inherently wonderfully magical. And that speaks to me of this kind of, when you talk about it, of course, it makes fucking sense that the symbols of the geomantic sigils, why would they be used in that thing? Well, again, why would there be a lot of conjunctio or manifestation ideas wanting to be done? Because that's what you're doing. A plate for geomantic manifestation might have all 16 figures, but it also might have a really big prominent conjunctio on it.
Yeah.
And that's like the nexus of power, and it contains those things. I think of, although it's not necessarily time related, but in like the Rune Guild training, where like you were encouraged to use the Handstad, like the hand signs of the runes, to contain events that happened. Like I remember this big one of like that screech of the subway that happens in New York, and I would make the hand sign for Raido. because it's something there about journey and this, like, I'm about to get on and I know what that sound means. And in this context, it's not stopping to not run into me. It's I'm waiting for it. So you can, every time you see it, you would, codify this in a hand gesture that also you said the rune's name. And this type of thing was very valuable. I think that type of bodily imprinting and capturing something in time in that way is incredibly helpful for how we do, so that when you use the hand signs later to spell out mantric formula over things like drink and consecrate, that every time you move your hand like that, it has some sense of a coding of all the times you've already codified it.
Yeah. The patina of every act that you've ever attracted or stored in the configuration of your fingers like that.
Yes. Like when Jetcha used to do a lot of hospital work, and especially before the pandemic, but we would go to a hospital and sing from bedside to bedside, often in convalescent homes or hospice homes. And it's very difficult work because you're not always, the hospital wants you there, but it doesn't mean the patients do.
Right.
But it's this confrontation with that. You're there as a group, you're learning, you're trying to sing. But the songs that we would use in Fool's Mass or other pieces were tried out in that way. And it coded those songs in that memory of that uncertainty of the rejection, as well as the times that it really worked. And you would see people cry and hug and say, no one's in 2 months. And the song it contains that now. So
that's beautiful.
Providing containers to fill up with our little, to make the Cliffa Noga, or what, in my heretical adaptation, sorry, David, but to fill up these containers with experience, with the time-bound expression of what we have. Time may be an illusion, and we can, portray it in many ways, but it's still that dichotomy between, we think about time both as particle and wave, as linear and cyclical, or else we wouldn't have, a 7-day week with planetary correspondences. We wouldn't have months and seasonal rounds. We think in seasonal time, we just pretend that it's linear. And that's because of our own journey, right, of aging. But not everybody ages in the same way. It's just all of that goes fast, and it goes very strongly for me into the metrics of time, where certainly we can look at astrology through many lenses. And a description of Western astrology that I like is it is trying to capture a specific time of year, with the constellations being, or that the signs of the zodiac not being attributed to the constellations, but rather the constellations were in them. And why tropical still works for many people that adhere to it is because it's capturing seasonal variants. The fire of Aries must come out of the wet Pisces, right, to jumpstart the earth, that you need that rambunctious ram to ramp up the year agriculturally. So there's that side of it. And similarly, I look at the other things that are called astrology, whether it's Mesoamerican, where a day is containing a certain energy, and that imparts a part of its soul to each person. That part of our makeup is tied into the day that we are born on, and that we can, if you're born on a bad day, they don't let you see the sun, and the sun bestows that, it kind of pins that day inside you. So you just wait until there's a good day a couple days from now and hide the baby inside for a couple of days.
Right. But marking these things isn't just about realizing how we are buffeted by, vast impersonal forces. It's also about how we find the wiggle room.
Yeah, which is exactly the same as what you're talking about, or we've been talking about, with saving the remnants of these times in charms, right? So that we can use that to influence later, in the same way that, it's saving seeds to plant at a time where you wouldn't normally have those seeds available.
Right. Another basis for, as we talked about before, the basis of understanding talismans as making jam, right, which Giambattista della Porta talks about, as do a bunch of historians of magic, that the reason you elect astrologically is so that you can gather the virtues present in that tide, and then be able to have a little battery of them to draw upon, a solar battery, or a solunar battery, or a sidereal battery, so that when the moon ain't doing that, you still have some of its, something that witnessed it, and something that can transmit its reflection.
Yes. Yeah. And then we can see the overlap here, right, with planetary hours, which are the little astronomical clock of the day to day.
Yeah.
And there are different forms of calculation of that. And certainly the most popular is the 12 and 12. But we already have two concurrent calendars there, because, right, it's not the same day that starts the sunrise as the sunset. And that for what rules the night is different. And you get these two concurrent calendars that used to be very acknowledged, that now it's no, it's still a Sunday. Is it though? Because, there's a different planet that rules at night when you go into anything.
Yeah. And I need to do more comparison, but I think I was telling you the other day about getting more into looking at the mystical heptarchy. One of the first systems that Dee channels has a system of 5 ministers, a king and a prince of each day and planet, but that the prince of the planet is not appealed to on the planet's day. I need to check this, but it looks like it's the same, so that the Mercurial king is served by, I think, a Saturnine prince. So you have this idea.
Yeah. That's the relations, right? Yeah. So Saturday is Wednesday night.
Yeah.
Sunday is Thursday night.
Yeah.
Monday is Friday night, and Tuesday is Saturn's night, and Wednesday is Sun night, and
And Dee doesn't gloss it in those terms. He talks about it in terms of like you appeal to the king for sheer knowledge of that planetary purview and power, but that the prince helps manifest it. So again, we're into kind of goal and means, right? That the Mercurial must be in some way bounded by the Saturnine to manifest.
I like it. Yeah, time is. I fucking love this. Like the metrics of that, like where we just entered Lent. And Lent itself is this weird time out of time of, the commemoration of 3 passages, but 2 that actually say what it is in Luke and Matthew that describe Jesus's isolation in the desert to kind of purify himself in this 40 days and 40 nights thing, which is 6 weeks. But this periods where preparing for another time is so fascinating. How do you stay present when it's like Advent, you're preparing for Christmas, but what does that mean? Are you trying to do all the stresses so that you can enjoy Christmas Day? Is that real? Or Michael's Lent, which isn't even observed much anymore. Like it's not a common thing, but you start at the Assumption of the Virgin, right? And then you go through to St. Michael's Day, 40 days of fasting to celebrate the angels and specifically Michael. It's St. Francis was a big fan of this Michael's Lent, but these periods of celebration, or like I'm reminded very much of my boyfriend talking about constantly emphasizing he has a birthday month. Which is a very Leo thing to say. But how do we use time to prepare for a future time is also of interest to me here, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, totally. And
the same way that metrics are about using time to then, as we've proposed with folk expression and Grimoric expression, using time to solve the problems of a future time.
Yes. Yeah. What can we do now to ensure our best success to come? Yeah. I think about, you mentioning Lent, and I think about it is a period of Jesus's purification. We talk about it as this temptation, and it's both, but it's not purification as this like boring white room of seclusion. It's purification through resisting temptation. Like he's not in the wilds as an escape, like meditating under a waterfall. It's being more present, the wild as where the dust devils dwell, right? Yeah, it's going to, anyone can be enlightened on a mountaintop. Can you get the same with, someone's sweaty armpit shoved into your nose on the subway, On
Facebook, where everyone is enlightened. This time out of time thing too. It's almost like we chose our topics today for this. This notion when something only happens once a year or is so few times a year that we see it always seems to add a notion of longevity to whatever that magical thing is, even though it's actually more fleeting than what we would normally expect. And that's an interesting side of it, right? Or like even the February 29th, you have fewer birthdays, you live longer. But specifically,
or you die younger.
So sad.
Okay, that was sad. Sing to me of Night Blooming Sirius.
Yeah, there we go. That's where I'm going in, not wishing our leap year friends early death. No. But Night Blooming Sirius is not one plant, but it itself is legion. There are various cacti and epiphytes that are called Night Blooming Sirius. The one that I grew up calling that is the Epiphyllum oxypetalum, which was really heavily proliferated in the US. But there are a number of other genus, but they are all belonging to this tribe, Syriae, which are these beautiful, strange dragon flowers that open up, usually white or white with peach or orange, far extent little petals, whatever they're called. But they have various names, right? Where you have like Christ in the Manger, Dama de Noche, or Dama de Noche, or Huela de Noche, or Queen of the Night. Queen of Air and Darkness isn't one of my favorites, but that's just a weird little side there. Princess of the Night. But either way, you have this flower that looks a little bit Audrey 2-ish that comes off of an epiphyte or a cactus. and you can tell it's going to open. It has these tendrils. Dragon fruit looks kind of like it, but it opens, and suddenly it's this flower that is now at least 10 inches, if not a foot or more in diameter, and it will be gone by the next day. It will have lost all of its appeal. Now, when something blooms that rarely, it usually has a very strong scent. Hopefully one that we like, unlike a corpse lily. But it is an opiate smell. It is just an intoxicating smell. It is healthy plants can get 3 flushes, like one in the beginning of summer, one in the middle, one towards the end. But more often than not, it's one flush. It's just, especially if it's not in a high humidity area. So there's a lot of lore around it because of this. And you see it being not used, but the idea that it grants wishes is very prominent. It does have a relationship to Brahma in Ayurveda and to Hinduism, where a wish whispered with it in bloom is said to be heard 1,000 times more, or 10,000 times more, or whatever the specific folklore of the area is. Sometimes noting it to like the positive version of an eclipse. Even though if you do mantras during an eclipse, it's said that it's increased 10,000 times because you're doing that work of converting poison. It's used for medicine in India and Southeast Asia. It's used to treat respiratory ailments and bleeding conditions. But the real thing of it is that there are parties around this plant. And that's how I grew up with it. My grandmother had a large amount of it growing outside the breakfast room window at the home ranch in California. And so outside of this, the Mediterranean villa house that my great-grandparents built, my grandmother would call all of the people who were local and say, it's going to bloom tonight, because she would know when she woke up, you could see. So when you went into the driveway, you could smell it from 50 feet away, because there are 100 flowers that are blooming. And it's intense to see a flower go through this much transformation in such a short time. But it's similarly, I believe, if you've seen Crazy Rich Asians, there is a bloom party for a night blooming Sirius in it, where it's celebrated. People would have whole little ball celebrations around the blooming of this plant, and the family that is keeping a plant like this that actually blooms well. Because of this, there's a lot of lore in keeping the petals. If you can sever the flower before it's fully, because it will wilt really quickly. You don't want it to wilt on its own unless you're just being nice and letting the plant do it. But like this idea of magically capturing the plant in that way, it's just intoxicating. So this idea that it takes us back to creation, that it whispers directly to the gods who are creating the world in previous eras and in future eras, that this manifests wishes, that there is just a joy and an exuberance that comes with this specific cactus in that way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I didn't know about the bloom parties. I've been meaning to watch Crazy Rich Asians. It's got Aquafina in it, I think, who I very much enjoy. Yeah, that's beautiful. I didn't know about the parties. That's wonderful that it isn't just a private thing for the people cultivating it. It speaks of the work. There's something of the work of just toiling, finally producing a result, right? That the bloom is fleeting, but that the bloom is the result of the plant laboring all that time.
Yes. Yeah, there's something just beautiful about it. And certainly in Southern United States culture and the West, where I've been grown outdoors, it's a lot. It's just, there's so many memories of people. You go to your relative's house, usually your grandma's, and there's just this smell that fills everything. You have tea and you watch it undrape its petals, and there's so many of them. It's oxypetalum, right? So this is a night too that as a child, I remember if it wasn't fully open, we stayed until it opened. So like you got to stay up late and watch this flower. And it was like a fairy appearing. And the other people I knew that grew up with this, it's a similar thing of just the lore that comes with this. As far as like devas and plants and a presence, something happens. Because all of a sudden, what's there, you smell it. You smell her arrival, and she's just in full splendor in front of you. So I truly love this notion of preciousness that happens with the one time. You get like poems to it of refulgent Soraya, referring to the flower as Soraya, having this more female ending to the Sirius. But it's a gorgeous flower with a lot of kind of restoring hope. This strong smell that comes with it. That smells like it's the opioids. Like it's just that weird body buzz that you get from smelling it. As if we're moths ourselves or things that have to pollinate in it is beautiful. So I think that the flower itself, through its singular blooming season or blooming day, evokes that kairotic shift as well. Kairos being time out of time.
Right, or the right time rather than just the linear time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kairos is, beautiful, like with a punk haircut of like she's shaved headed in these early modern emblematics, except for a tuft of hair at the front, very punk. But the idea is that you can grab time as it's coming, but want the right time as it comes. But once it's past you, it's already too late. And she's got knives and like flies around on a giant winged ball and things like that. Yeah. Kairos is fascinating. Yeah.
If anybody else from the Southern, I'm sure it exists outside of Southern California too, but a lot of us from Catholic schools went on a specific retreat called the Kairos Retreat, which was a huge it was a collective field trip that you were there for several days, and it was this exposure to how Christ's love had filled you. You know, it's testimonies to the Spirit. It's about as Protestant as you get within a culture, but it also, for a few days in this, all boys Catholic school, the people that went on that trip were kind of changed and were friendlier to each other. And I noticed some relationships with people that stayed, like people checked in on you throughout the year, even though they weren't in your social groups. But like at the end of the year, they would give you like, I haven't talked to you since the retreat, but I wanted to give you this going away present type of thing.
Oh.
And there's always a stone that was associated with it, like an emblem. So it's funny that because Kairos has all those connotations for me, and I think a lot of at least the Southern California Catholic kids. But I remember that retreat well. It was very weird. There's a lot of music I didn't know that was used because they did the like play music, have a story, have a group breakout, play some music, have a story, have a group breakout. But speaking of music and having a group breakout, that judgment card.
Play trumpets, play.
Yeah. What you were saying that you were having a difficult time tracing the specific iconography of it?
Oh, I mean, there's books and stuff on it, but there's not. Yeah, I guess because it's so front row in your face biblical, there isn't so much. I haven't seen so much of a breakdown of the specific tarot-ness of its iconography as much, which is an odd way of saying that, I suppose. But you're right. It's the Last Judgment. It's is the trumpet, Gabriel or Israfel or Raphael, but it's absolutely
sometimes Michael even, honestly.
Right. Yeah. The big three.
Because the idea that like, yes, it's delivering a message, so Gabriel is a big one, but for a large amount of church history, it was Michael because it announces the end. It announces the war. Yeah. Like that's its own thing of like, now the armies are coming. That's a war trumpet as opposed to like everybody get out of here, very come out wherever you are.
And that everyone, rises like Dracula because they're all buried in the proper direction.
Yeah, and naked at that.
Yes.
Like gray and naked. Where did they? Well, I don't remember them. People weren't. Like, were you buried naked in a winding sheet? I thought you were.
Sometimes, yes. Protestant traditions very much like that idea of like we are all equal in the grave. And there's also some specific stuff that happens in the 17th century around trying to aid. It's like a what do you call it? Like a subsidy for textile industries. That linen versus cotton, and if the rougher one was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for you too. But the grayness of them is like does bring in some like zombie kind of aspects, right?
Yeah, but she is still blonde. Let's give her that. But there's something really that's interesting, right? Because then the winding sheets mean that ghosts are really just being modest.
Yes,
here to us. They don't want to show us their dangly bits.
And again, they're dressed in poor people clothes or a poor person's material. They might still have a nice smock and a cap and things like that. And that's where we also get so many amazing stories about bakers, especially, who are rising, well before the crack of dawn, going home after a long shift and being mistaken for ghosts and shot at. Because apparently that's what you do when you see a ghost and you don't expect it in at least the 18th century.
Fascinating.
Yeah. It's again because like it's along with death, it's another one of those cards that I think can come up in readings for people who are not come up for them, but can present challenges for clients who are already kind of primed to be looking for the bad news. And the idea of it being judgment when you've asked a question can sometimes have those kind of like, we're going to have to frame this in a way that you can actually integrate rather than, being told this is a grand proclamation. I don't know. How have you found when you've read tarot that like, how does judgment play out in like the everyday of people asking about a new job or a relationship or something?
Well, first off, I would like to say, as a resident of the great state of New York, that I read tarot for informational and educational purposes only, and make no qualms or claims about it predicting anything other than a pictorial exploration of current synchronistic psychology. Okay, that said, it's connected often to specifically Revelation 20, right? Judgment of the Dead. Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire, and the lake of fire is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. This is the permanence, right? Things catching up with you is always how I interpret it. It's not necessarily judgment overall, although it can signify an official pronouncement depending on its context. I'm a contextual reader. I'm an open reader. I'm not necessarily always a spread person. Yeah. But the idea that the chickens are coming home to roost is going to be here. This is, I mean, if we're going to talking about it, right? The outcomes of our actions are here. Or the Welsh triad thing of like rewards and punishments are not the consequences of our actions, but the properties of them.
This is the find out of the fuck around.
Yes, yes. Which is interesting because the imagery on the card is actually from earlier in that same passage or that same chapter of Revelation, where the dragon is loose. But, I saw they came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. So the card actually refers to both of them in the sense that judgment here is at first in the first resurrection, according to Revelation, which is its own little, mycelial rhizomatic exploration of vision, is going to be that you were so in line with Christ's teachings that you are judged instantly and given the ability to reign with him for 1,000 years. And you will not have to suffer the actual judgment. Their judgment is already done. If you act right away, as these good people seem to have, they are going to reign with Jesus for 1,000 years. And then at the end of those 1,000 years, the rest of everybody else comes to, and then they are judged. I do love and we've talked about this before. I think we did it when Jay was on, but the Islamic tradition of after the judgment, when the angels, especially Jibril, meets Allah for the first time, and Muhammad is there, peace be upon him. But the idea that like Jibril has executed, and Israfil has executed Allah's plans without ever having met Allah. Like that, it's just pure faith, pure order. Like this is the impulse that I have. And that part of that process after the judgment, post-judgment, is that death, the angel of death, kills all the angels. And then the angel of death also dies. And it is just Allah again, in unification with all that is. So is this an actual killing of things, or is it a lack of or a nogalizing of the cliff off of the boundary between us, getting rid of the inherent subject-object objectification issues? I don't know. Judgment is so, as you said, so Christian a card. It's so evocative of a specific theology. But as far as what it comes to, like when you go into the Crowley deck, right, the top deck,
when it's Aeon,
it's Aeon, which is a different thing, complete, like very, very different in comparison. So Aeon being almost zeitgeistian, right? There's aeons that have come in the past and we can judge them and have, contextualized knowledge about what happened during them because they've passed. There's this prediction of what's coming, right? That we are in the Aeon of Horus and that the Aeon of Mat would eventually happen and perhaps even overlap it. But this idea that the crowned and conquering child reigning and everything goes on, it's a different take on everything. Aeon
has this definite sense of progression, and again I also am not an OTO initiate, so I don't want to be speaking out of pocket, but there's still a conception that there is.
They're a friendly crowd. They'll be fine if you mess it up.
Oh, you get to correct me? That was my gift to you. I know how much you love that there is still a sense of like the ending of something is the beginning of something else. I don't want to say like a full cycle of like we're going to go back to an Aeon of Osiris, but that the end of something is the beginning of something else, as opposed to the linear models of many Christian millenarianisms and apocalypticisms that at the end of it, a bunch of judgment or not judgment happens, a bunch of consequences happen, but that rather it's not about God sweeping all the pieces back into the box and finishing everything. It's not about the end of time or reality or the universe. It's that the end of something else. In the ashes of something else, we find the embers of something new.
What happens at the end of the Mayan calendar? You mean it starts over? But because the thought deck specifically, right, is going from this progression with some changes that are in there. But as we go for, justice becomes adjustment and temperance becomes art, there's this transmutation that's happening where it's an active involvement with rather than perhaps a passive recognition. So judgment becomes Aeon and world becomes universe. And, Aeon, I think one of the keys there is to differentiate between Aeon and universe, which Aeon specifically feels time, and universe feels space to me.
Yeah.
And so if judgment is time, it is time catching up with us, the finiteness of our actions, the reach, the ripples of the stone thrown tomorrow that lands yesterday, a la Eshu.
Yeah.
And the world is the expansiveness that can happen and contextualizes each of those things. So can those things be intrinsically untangled enough to make different cards? Yes, but judgment versus the perfected world and the New Jerusalem that is symbolized in the world card. There's something there, I think. Speaking of time and surfing through it, we picked Merlin because, dude ages backwards.
Yeah.
And also because I really love entering into the mythic with our dead magicians, because I think that the recent centuries kind of decrying of myth and legend as something outside of time as a negative thing, as opposed to it's always current, entering the repertoire through myth as opposed to the archival of history, and that these myths inform our history in such a lovely way, that Merlin is many people that have existed, and therefore the possibility of meeting Merlin in your lifetime is greatly increased because it is mythic.
Right. And what are one of the ways that happens? Sure, like a particular folk hero or demigod or something like that, but also it becomes an office. And I was just checking through a bunch of Dr. Francis Young's book Magic in Merlin's Realm, A History of Occult Politics, where he absolutely talks about not only the broader theme of where magic and statecraft meet, but paying particular attention to the figure of the magus as the one who aids the king and also like further legitimizes them.
Yeah.
Dee is referred to as a Merlin. William Lilly, some of his early pamphlets before his big hit single of Christian astrology is Merlini Anglici, the English Merlin. So this idea of it's something that's so big it becomes like a title, right? It feels not unlike brand name recognition confusing, right? The fact that a lot of English people refer to vacuuming as hoovering, which we've talked about a lot before, right? Like that's the sign that you've actually lost sway in the market, but you've achieved something else. Yeah.
I'm curious, and because there's the easy to access history of Merlin, right? Is that it's 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth.
Yes. The author of pseudo histories. I think that's politely framed these days. Again, print the myth, Yes, that's the easy way to start. We're definitively talking about the Wizard of King Arthur. And again, we don't just have Merlin becoming other people, we have him emergent from other people. Crucially, an amalgamation of a couple of legendary figures, especially Ambrosius and Merthin, who are two prophets primarily. They're kind of talked about mad poets kind of thing, who were not previous to Monmouth, to Uncle Geoffrey, considered to have had any significant Arthurian connections.
But he then is tokenizing, right? So he's kind of taking from things that exist so that it seems even more real.
The air of verisimilitude, as daft racist H.P. Lovecraft will put it. Yeah.
Okay, so the landmarks of Merlin. He's a cambion. He's a half-breed. Mortal and an incubus, which is how he gets his magical abilities. He's a prophet. He can shapeshift. He's a sage. He manipulates, sort of Bene Gesserit-like, about the birth of the promised conquering King Arthur. And he's an advisor and mentor to the young king. And then he leads a bunch of prophecies. And he's sometimes said to have been killed or fallen in love with and left with by the Lady of the Lake. And so he either retires or is dead, but either way, he is no more.
Right. The time of myth and legend is a little bit over, but not fully over, because potentially, like Arthur, he sleeps until he is needed again.
Yes. And so the various permutations of his legend, they make him many other things, many other matings, pairings, right? So he has Gwendolyn, Lady of the Lake, Morgan Le Fay, and Sibylla. So, connection to Sybil here, which is, a demon we look forward to exploring in the future. Also, there seems to be a connection here, I think, to your raven peeps, right? Because not necessarily ravens, but blackbirds specifically.
Yes.
As being very significant here, which in a larger context, right? Like Irish. The frenzy, Shivna is the ballad. Oh my God, my brain is mixing up how to pronounce things that I don't remember seeing in print in my head. Anyway, the madness or the frenzy of
inspiration.
Yes. Well, no, not the concept, but it's a specific ballad. It's the Irish equivalent of Merlin. the Battle of Magrat, and it continues on into stuff. But anyway, there's this whole thing where it's the blackbird that comes, and this kind of ties it into this larger context of the powers of blackbirds, right? Or little blackbirds, and the folklorists that constantly are bringing that in. It even plays into, like, if we brought up the King of the North later, you see the three-eyed raven kind of coming in its way here. We've talked about Martin of Tours before, and here we have another connection here with Merlin being said to have taken some of Martin of Tours' folkloric ascriptions to his magical prowess.
Right. He's not just wild in the sense of, I mean, in the earlier depictions, he is a little more like almost woodwosey, but it's the wild is not a stranger to him. And indeed, he has, alliances everywhere.
Which is interesting with, as far as the Martin of Tours thing, because the syncretic side is that many folklorists have proposed that Merlin was based upon Martin of Tours, and there are many people that are saying it might be the other way around. Folkloric need for this figure and the prominence of Martin of Tours' feast being Martinmas, and the lore around Martinmas, and the sacrifices that take place to go into the dark winter. So there's a lot of things going on there. Margin, Merlin.
Yeah. Oh God, there's so many possible etymologies. So many of them. I didn't pick one that I liked especially, but I do think this sense of like his shape shifting is not just in terms of, again, playing the oldest game, and again, shout out to a childhood being utterly enraptured by the sword and the stone scenes, but that he has adapted himself to fit different political climates as well. So we have some of the earliest English verse romance about him in the late 13th century of Arthur and of Merlin, which draws on various different Vulgate Arthurian legends and kind of chronicles and stuff. But that in these medieval texts, these English authors kind of conflate the sub-Roman Britain with the Kingdom of England, which is not the same thing necessarily, at least in time. And that's fascinating because like the Anglo-Saxon enemies, like against whom Merlin aids Uther and later Arthur, are replaced either expressly by the Saracens or very like Top Gun, simply like an unspecified invading like pagan enemy, right? And so this, again, the application of his legends, his prophecies, his status, his role at different points to fulfill different political agendas feels really significant in this kind of shape-shifting and finding power and finding ways to slot him in, right? The unification of Scotland and England by James 1 or 6 is said to be a fulfillment of one of Merlin's prophecies, for instance.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things going on with Merlin kind of folklorically, between emphasizing the either kind of complete attunement to the natural world, and as Druidism gets kind of emphasized, in the 60s and later, and in Dramatic, Merlin becomes increasingly portrayed as a druid, as kind of different from his other aspects, as just seer without any specific notion of what that means, or as wizard, as sorcerer, as evidence of his, demonic birth, that the struggle between his two natures and what that means, and the kind of mixing into human affairs in such a strong way where he's not necessarily viewed as any type of heroic character. And by the time you get to the Disney movie, he's bumbling. Like, it's magic is portrayed as real, but something that the man that can do it well is bumbling. And it lost touch a little bit with reality, even though he has those serious moments, almost like Gandalf saying, Gandalf the Grey, especially, following in that kind of archetype, especially in modern portrayals in the movies.
And this again is illustrative of exact, I think it can be referenced exactly in terms of that like conception of druidry as a link back to pre-Christian Britons, and on the one hand, and trying to have your cake and eat it, basically. On the one hand being like, yes, it's this ancient wisdom, but also he's the one that sparks Arthur to find the Grail, right? And to be part of both Christian and very pagan conceptions of what power is, what wisdom is. And that does exactly produce this total mix of being demonically powerful and also kind of, alchemically bumbling. This mixed nature, as you put it, right, of his Cambianness. There's a wonderful quote I found from Peter H. Goodrich, who wrote Merlin, A Case Book, where he says, Merlin's primary characteristics continue to be recalled, refined, and expanded today, continually encompassing new ideas and technologies as well as old ones. The ability of this complex figure to endure for more than 14 centuries results not only from his manifold roles and their imaginative appeal, but also from significant, often irresolvable tensions or polarities. He says between beast and human, or wild man, between natural and supernatural in the sense of him being a wonder child, between the physical and the metaphysical as a poet, between the secular and the sacred as a prophet, between the active and the passive as a counselor, between magic and science as a wizard, and between male and female as a lover. He says, interwoven with these primary tensions are additional polarities that apply to all of Merlin's roles, such as those between madness and sanity, pagan and Christian, demonic and heavenly, mortality and immortality, and impotency and potency. I just really loved that.
Yeah. Merlin is obviously the archetype for a lot of things, as we talked about Gandalf, but like certainly Dumbledore comes to mind.
Yeah.
The interwovenness with or the idea that his students, because he has many that complicate the whole narrative of Arthur, right? Including sometimes the Lady of the Lake, sometimes not. Mm-hmm. She's a fairy, but or Morgan Le Fay might also, there's a lot of things going on there. Nimue, all these things, but Maven. But that although his magical abilities can be taught, he cannot teach prophecy.
Yeah.
And that this is an inherent gift that belongs to him. So this, I don't know, the notion of the brings to mind the Cassandra complex thing. Who would believe? Because they all believe that they can alter the future because they're all doing magic. There's something fascinating about the ladies around Merlin, especially, whether the unrequited love of Merlin, or perhaps weird crossing the boundary between student-teacher relationships, and the just constant reinvention. And again, the variance of this into popular lore shows that it was an archetype that was greatly enjoyed by people.
Right.
That Merlin himself lends himself to these many forms as a shapeshifter by definition, and in folkloric expression. The variants show that this was something being talked about.
Yeah. And for all of these shifting, he's not one thing or the other. He's also, grounded in some very particular places sometimes.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of associations with him with the town of Carmarthen, that the Marthen of that might have some etymological link back, or the other way around. And to dig into some of our own adventures, we've got Tintagel Castle, right?
Yeah.
So for those interested, dear listener, if you want to ever make the journey to the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle in Cornwall, just up the road is Tintagel Castle, which is a medieval fortification on the peninsula next to the village of, as was Trevenna, as is now Tintagel. And so the castle has all sorts of Arthurian associations, from Geoffrey of Monmouth's assertion that it was there that Arthur was conceived. And that's, as we've said, that's all about supposedly, again, in his Bene Gesserit meddling, he disguises King Uther to resemble the Duke of Cornwall, Gorlois, the husband of Igraine, who's Arthur's mother. But again, significantly below the castle is a cave called Merlin's Cave, which is a sea cave which passes completely through Tintagel Island from the haven on the east of the west coast on the west. Well, obviously, that's why it's the West Cove. And it fills up at high tide, but at low tide, you can absolutely get down there and find all sorts of cool rocks.
There are a lot of cool rocks. It is true. I remember the first year I went with you there, it was like, okay, great. We got some stuff. We go up to the top. This is great. I went back a second year, and we walked the footpath from, when you're in Boscastle, when you go up to the left, they're like, oh, Tintagel's that way. You're like, it's a mere 5 miles as the crow flies.
Right.
It is over hill, over dale, over everything on the way, climbing over sheep rock, rock fences, and passing trailer parks and everything else. It is not an easy walk.
Just up the road. Just up the road.
The feet hurts. And the soul hurts in memory of how painful it was to then not be able to walk for 3 days. But it was beautiful. Also, very thirsty. Take water. There was one point where there was a stream, and I was like, I'm drinking from the white part. I got to. I'm thirsty. So no parasites, and a beautiful walk through sheep country. Right after, thinking about the lectures about how Cornwall has been so continuously occupied by people have been there since the 5000 BCs, that during storms, ancient graves just wash off the cliffs, and bones are discovered on the beaches all the time, which leads to, lots of wonderful things. But anyway, it's a beautiful walk. There's a lot of lore there. I'm always happy to go back, but with the proper shoes.
Yeah. I want to go back there and recite some Tennyson, right? The Idylls of the King, which is one of the things that makes Merlin's Cave famous, which is where he's describing the waves bringing the infant Arthur to the shore and Merlin carrying him to safety. Yeah.
I'm reminded of the Sam Neill Merlin's miniseries.
Oh, yeah.
Where it was seen as the war ultimately in magic between Morgan Le Fay as the old ways, the pagan ways, and the Christians of Arthur choosing Christianity, and Merlin siding with the Christians eventually because of Morgan Le Fay's extreme being the Morrigan, basically. But that the way that they defeat her in the end is that they forget her. And they have to sit there in a massive thing and turn around and somehow convince themselves that she no longer exists. I don't know how anybody can do that. But it works, and she does the, like, what a world exit.
Mhm.
Feel for her. But it's also, there's a lot of things with Merlin too, where it's like we see a lot of it. I feel like Merlin is a symbol, or a name even, of the misinformation or the over romanticization of the fairy faiths, and how difficult the folklore is. It's like, it's not, again, fairies are not things you want in your house.
Right.
We can't avoid having a few house spirits here and there, but like, we feed so that they don't come steal the baby and make a changeling, and we give offerings at the tree so that the tree doesn't steal our children. So it's as much placation to unseen forces, not necessarily the fluency with them, that was what was preserved. And Merlin has a lot of that. You also get the other mini series where it's like the talking to the dragon, and it's just a young. It's because when you image search Merlin, it used to be one thing, but now it is a completely.
Yeah, he keeps being reinvented. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like movies and TV and such are creating folklore for us, and that is how it should be. That is exactly what these romance books about Merlin did as well.
Yeah.
It so happens that people are doing visuals now.
Yeah.
I think. Did we get through everything? I think we
I
did.
think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Somehow, and I
Mhm.
will say in more timely a manner than usual. So I can blame it on the edit later. Totally.
Yeah, no, this has been great. I mean, yeah, sometimes, as we've said before, to talk a little bit about how the sausage is made, like sometimes it is a set of like, oh, I'm really interested in this thing. I want to talk about this week or this month. And sometimes we're like, okay, that makes me think of this. That makes me think of this. That'll be cool to talk. And even though I knew that we'd laid these out in a way that like, oh yeah, that's going to flow into that, I've been really, really delighted to think about time and malleability and the Kairos out of the Chronos and back again, and the dissolution of things and the reinvention of things, from the washing of the feet to the nape of the punk hairdo.
And certainly populous, not poor.
Not this time. Not this
I
time.
studied for a different test. No, populous. Populous, as far as figure and corresponding Odu, is we've talked about before, but is wonderfully, like as you said, the blackness of time that is the eraser of all things, the great leveler. So from the wizard that travels backwards in time to who utters prophecies and manipulates bloodlines to achieve the once and future king, to the saint who bears the name of a more popular saint but died on the right day to lend himself to this particular year's expressions, and the night blooming Sirius, or the queen of the night, who opens her petals to allow us to sense that kairotic shift of what it is like to dwell in that one moment of scent and mortality, to the sands of the hourglass as they shift and bury us all. Quick nod to that, was it the Snow White movie, where the queen does that? It's Sigourney Weaver as the Wicked Queen, and she does the hourglass spell with the bird and buries Snow White in a landslide in a mine cave-in with the dwarves. But yeah. So to judgment itself, because who are we to judge if not the perfect ones to judge? But I think the need to compare, and because of finiteness and finite resources and things like this makes judgment something that we all go through. Judgment, self-judgment, as well as judgment of others. Certainly it's life preserving itself at first to say, that eventual development of prejudice of those berries, that color is bad, don't eat them, to projections of less helpful prejudices, and making sure that we stay open to the moment. That philosophical dribble is brought to you by a lovely hibiscus mango tea. Yeah, that was great. But thank you for, as always, it's always a pleasure. Please check out our website, radiofreegolgotha.com, and the Facebook group for Folk Necromancy. We do update our talks section on the website for any current or planned engagements organized by month. If you want to hear either of us speak or show up and heckle, as long as you totally cool.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, I heckle Al for free. That's my and Porterfield. But yeah, have I left anything out? I don't.
No, I don't think so. No, delight as always. Yeah, thanks for joining us on this weaving through time, everyone. Yeah, it's great to be able to put these together and chat to people about them afterwards as well. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. And you don't have to go home, but you need to get out of my house. I'll catch you soon.
Take care, everyone.
And thank you, dear listener. Have a lovely chaotic shift.
In the bathroom or outside, yeah. Take care, everyone. Thank you, Jesse.